It was inevitable that as church and empire came together, the church would be transformed forever. But again, it wasn't an overnight transformation.
Bishops had always been local church leaders, but for some time it had been recognised that the bishops of 5 major centres had some authority simply by virtue of their standing in the Christian world. These 5 bishops, or patriarchs as they were known, were from Jerusalem, Antioch, Constantinople, Alexandria, and Rome. Their position was considered as first among equals. They didn't have any greater say in the running of the church than other local church bishops, but by virtue of their location, people had to listen to what they had to say. However, soon 5 became 2. The Roman Empire was crumbling, and the patriarchs of Constantinople and Rome survived the onslaught of new enemies because, well, in Rome's case, they were prepared to do deals with the attackers, and in the case of Constantinople, because that's where the empire took longest to die.
The churches of Rome and Constantinople were so involved in the politics of the time that it's difficult to separate out the history of the church and the history of the state. Not surprisingly, the business of being a church often took second place to the business of being an empire. Now, the bishops of Rome increased their influence by fair means or foul. Not all of them were as bad as they're sometimes portrayed to be. Let's take a look at 2 men, both named Gregory, to illustrate what we mean. The first Gregory, Gregory I, also called Gregory the Great, was Bishop of Rome from 590 to 604 AD.
Gregory I, or Gregory the Great as he is now known, was a wily, astute and clever leader. His reign as Pope, as bishops of Rome became to be known, marked the transition of the church from religious organisation to political one. He made treaties of his own with the Lombard invaders of Italy, and so secured both his position and his influence. He was a good man. During that particular invasion, he sold off church lands to provide money to buy food and shelter for the poor and displaced citizens of Italy.
He was also a great evangelist. It was Gregory who sent an Italian abbot, Augustine, to Great Britain on his first mission, and he also sent people on missions to other parts of the Roman Empire.
Gregory the Great was theologically fairly conservative. Some of his beliefs were positively Protestant. He was a great follower of Augustine of Hippo, and believed that only Christ could in grace rescue sinners from the consequences of sins. He believed in using pictures in churches, but only if they were there to help the illiterate understand Bible stories. They were not, he said, to be worshipped or prayed to. He was a hymn writer, and in fact we still use some of his hymns in the church today. However, he did have some blind spots, and he was the first bishop of Rome to support the doctrine of purgatory, an in-between place where believers, he said, paid the penalty for their sins. He passionately claimed that none of the 5 patriarchs had the right to assert themselves over the others. Whoever calls himself a universal priest or desires that title is the forerunner of the Antichrist, he said. A rather embarrassing pronouncement for the Catholic Church, as it was the very next bishop, a man called Boniface III, who did just that.
Now compare him with another Gregory 500 years on and see how much things had slipped.
Hildebrand was a chaplain to a former pope and became Bishop of Rome in 1073, known as Gregory. The Roman Church as we know it today largely dates from his time. He issued the papal decree which set out his views of the papacy, including that the Roman bishop alone has the authority to be universal over all. The Roman bishop is alone responsible for appointing bishops throughout the world. All princes must kiss the feet of the Roman bishop and obey him. The Roman bishop cannot be judged by anyone. The Church of Rome has never erred and never will. The Bishop of Rome is actually holy himself, and the Church of Rome is the only true church.
What a change! Not surprisingly, when the bishops of Rome set themselves up as the absolute authorities, there were no checks or controls. And most of the strange views of Catholicism can be traced back to this lack of any objective challenge to the authority of the Pope, over and above even the Bible. Now, why had these changes come about? Well, not for any Christian reason, that's for sure. It was all about power. They were politically motivated changes. The early notion of a church as a community of believers in the world had been completely lost. But how did the bishops of Rome have the power to make these kinds of changes? Well, the basis for many of the changes they brought in was a forged document called the Donation of Constantine. This document surfaced around 700 AD and claimed to be a letter from Constantine the Great to the Bishop of Rome at the time, a man rather improbably called Sylvester.
In it, Constantine granted the right to the bishops of Rome to govern Rome and the entire empire from that time on. It was exposed as a forgery about 700 years later, but for the whole of that time it remained the basis for the most extraordinary and extravagant claims made by the Church of Rome.
However, it's also important to ask how these changes ever found favour with the ordinary man or woman. Didn't they see through them? Didn't they realise what was going on? The answer to that question is found very simply in Rome's most powerful creation, the priesthood.
If you remember, each early church was led by a local bishop, assisted by presbyters, perhaps what we would call elders today. When the church became state-sponsored, the bishops became town leaders, and the presbyters took control of smaller local churches. Eventually, these presbyters were called priests, but it's the theology behind them the church used to control people.
We have seen how early bishops of Rome, like Gregory I, did not believe in the absolute authority of the church, even though they claimed salvation was only through the church. But as the bishops' quest for power increased, so did the need for controlling people. This the church did through asserting its own right to be able to forgive sins alone. The Pope was the appointed go-between, they said, between men and God. The priests were his agents. So there was no other way to receive or continue in forgiveness other than through the priesthood.
Early Catholic scholars like Peter Lombard rejected this view, but it was taken up with enthusiasm by later scholars such as Thomas Aquinas, and is still a view held by the Roman Catholic Church today. God gives the Church, or more specifically the Bishop of Rome, the absolute power to forgive sins. You can see where that leads. The fires of hell await those who do not toe the line, and the Church, you can be sure, made much of the pain and anguish of hell. Who would dare go against the Church in such circumstances? Excommunication was not just being thrown out of church, it was being thrown out of heaven. And this lever was used in battles with King John here in the UK and the French and German kings of the Middle Ages. This famous picture of Gregory VII depicts the French king Henry IV pleading for forgiveness after he had been excommunicated. Though Henry tried to stand up to the Pope, he eventually had to give in to the power that Gregory VII wielded.
The Christian faith became one of fear and ritual rather than joyful obedience. Priests became the local power brokers. It was impossible even to criticise them for fear of losing your ticket to heaven. And this structure proved to be a very helpful way for the Church of Rome to raise cash. Because it, and it alone, had the power of forgiveness, the bishops quickly realised they could sell forgiveness for a fat cheque.
They did this by playing up the idea of purgatory. This was somewhere, they said, in between earth and heaven, where believers would pay for their sins. We can let you off some of that, they claimed, for a good price. Well, who wouldn't pay up? These get-out-of-jail cards became known as indulgences.
In your groups, take a moment now to consider some of these Roman practices and see what Scripture says about them.